Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Michael, how are you this afternoon? Or evening, actually.
There I
It's
am.
evening.
Well, with the exception that the afternoon is long past us. I'm doing well.
Long passes.
How are you?
Oh, we do have to mention. This is the Brian Wilson Memorial
It
episode.
is.
Right?
I saw that.
Yeah. Not a good week for America, but also not a good week for anyone who cares about music. I think 20th century music, because Sly Stone on Monday dies at 82. Brian Wilson dies at 82.
This is a big one.
This was a big one. This is not a happy week. But we're going to try to sail through all these things and talk about attention and Jenny Odell. We're going to talk. So this is part two, basically, of our Odell two-parter, where we've been talking about artist and teacher and writer Jenny Odell, her book, her 2019 book, How to Do Nothing. And this episode is going to focus on chapter 4, exercises and attention. And what we're going to do, well, we're going to eventually sort of try to connect our discussion of Jenny Odell back to previous episodes on Cal Chayka and Daisy Alioto and the notion of the taste economy, which are, and these are writings and philosophizing about the internet that takes place more contemporary, more recent essays and excursions into the notions of culture and taste and attention. And one of the things we'll do at the end is try to think about Odell's difference and similarity between her theorizing about how to do nothing and Chayka and Alioto's comments on the taste economy. But before we do that, Michael, I'm just going to try to describe, and you're going to help me, right?
Absolutely.
Hopefully. I'm just going to try to work through what I would say is the main purpose, Jenny Odell's main purpose in the and to give readers and listeners a kind of sense of her argument. Her main purpose in this essay, in this chapter rather, called Exercises in Attention. And on 111 in her text, she defines herself, and I thought I would read this moment of self-definition as a kind of way to get our bearings on the essay, but also to get our bearings on the larger topic of attention. Odell defines herself as a, quote, artist interested in using art to influence and widen attention. And any listener of critical media studies knows that we're interested in attention. We pay attention to attention in various modalities, because that seems to be the idea of the attention economy, I think, is something that we hearken to, but we have even more specific episodes and references to attention, because that's a key word for Bernard Stiegler, who we discuss on this podcast. And actually, most of our culture theorists that we talk about, Odell is certainly no exception, when they are talking about culture and curators, in a way, that's also talking about qualities of attention.
I want to add one thing,
Sure.
because I think that your choice of this particular line
Uh-huh.
is it's good, because if you follow it down a little bit longer, so I actually want to read like the next 5 or 6 lines,
Please, let's do
because
it.
what she does here, one of the things that I think is tricky in trying to pair up Odell with Alioto around the idea of the taste economy is the articulation of that connection. When we were talking about this earlier, I'd fumbled through it, and it's like you see it, but it's very difficult to talk about it, because fundamentally they're talking about two things that are very much overlapping, but somehow still very different, right? Between the aesthetic, which overlaps, but then we're
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
talking about,
Hmm.
a media company, or in Aliota's case, about her media company,
Hmm.
uh, which is now, buying and selling, and Odell, which seems to be very much more about being. So this line I found interesting because it points to the connection. She says, as an artist interested in using art to influence and widen attention, I couldn't help extrapolating the implications from visual attention to attention at large. It's a commonplace that we only see what we're looking for, but this idea of information that makes it into our brains without being admitted into consciousness seemed to explain the eeriness of suddenly seeing something that has been there all along. To me, this is Odell noting that, hey, in a world of stuff, we will attend to the things that we are looking for, that we anticipate, that we are familiar
Hmm.
with in some
Hmm.
capacity. Um, Part of what Alioto talked about when we were talking about her discussion of Web 3.0 and the opportunities that it might allow for curators, and in terms of, taste and the taste economy, was this idea that we could actually find the things that we are looking for intentionally. And so when we talk about Odell, and exercises and attention, and this the need to focus and to pay attention, I think here's this statement on her part that, hey, there's a lot of stuff out there, and we're only going to notice a small fraction, even if the brain registers all of it somehow. We're only going to be able to really notice and attend to a small fraction of that.
One of the interesting things about this chapter, well, may I do a brief comment here? Um, One of the interesting things about this chapter, I wonder if you found this interesting too, is that Odell, I mean, it's a really broad range of reading and reference.
Mm-hmm.
So there are philosophical thinkers that you would sort of expect and cultural figures that you would expect. But she also quotes social scientists and cognitive scientists and
Yeah.
people who are studying. uh, she's not afraid of using science and data driven and citing data driven information about cognitive studies. And one of the major takeaways I got from the chapter, um, this I think connects with your thing about intentionality, is that our brain, and this I would think is something very important to note about attention, that there's a curious paradox with our brains. It seems, if we trust the scientists, and why not, um, our brains are picking up
Mm-hmm.
a lot of stuff constantly. But attention uh, requires a kind of fixity of the will, or a kind of reattunement and readjustment, and it requires an adjustment of perception in order to, it's not like we're not taking it in. If our senses are working halfway properly, we're taking in a lot of information, but we have to account for these other things. We have to think about intentionality. We have to think about will. We have to think about these other things that we are bringing to the palate. The problem isn't that we're not absorbing a lot of information.
No, I
The
think it's
problem of
quite,
attention is not that. It's quite the opposite.
we're
So
absorbing.
this
Yeah.
is another reason that it's a complicated situation. We have to be deliberate. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And that was, to me, the thread that I
Indeed.
had such a
Indeed.
hard time teasing out
Yeah,
last
indeed.
time we spoke about this, because that runs consistently through both perspectives, or through both positions here
And
regarding.
through the other perspective being Alioto and the taste
Yes,
economy.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Well, listen, since we're already thinking about the mind and thinking about science and things like this, how about we have another moment? How about we turn to another favorite moment of mine in the essay because I like anything that references William James. And speaking of social scientists, the principles of psychology, one of the things that this, the passages that I'm going to read briefly on 112 and 113, if you're following along at home and you have a copy of How to Do Nothing in chapter 4, she references James's the principles of psychology, in particular, a quotation from James when James himself was kind of quoting, well, he is quoting the physicist and physician Hermann von Helmholtz. And I was just going to do a brief gloss of James and von Helmholtz before I read the quotes and we connect back up, Michael, to what you were saying about will and attention. Because it's also in this sort of grid about pro-science and using science and the humanities to sort of deal with this question of attention. When James is quoting Hermann Wilhelm, they're all Wilhelms to me, Hermann von Helmholtz, one of the things he's doing there is he's quoting really cutting edge scientific, hard scientific, actually materialist scientific studies of the brain. Really, the first kind of empirical materialist studies of the brain that we're talking about a scientist who is making a rigid distinction. Now, James himself is going to kind of complicate this in the principles of psychology and other in his later writings on pragmatism. But it's interesting that what Odell quotes from James is James gesturing to kind of the hard science of his day, because von Helmholtz was notorious for saying to study the mind, to study the brain, to study psychology, you're going to have to make a rigid distinction between the mind, which is tied to notions of soul and character and personality.
Right.
And instead, von Helmholtz wants to talk about the stuff, the literal stuff of the mind, right? The thing, right? That messy thing that's in between our head. So I just want to mention that as, this is an example of Odell's range, I think, and that she's going to all these sources. But what's going on? What is she quoting approvingly? Gets back to, I think, what you were just talking about a minute or two ago, that to come to grips with attention, we're going to have to come to grips with will and intentionality. So let me read a couple passages here. The relationship finds one of its most compelling. So there's a definition of attention. She notes that attention itself comes from the Latin, means to stretch toward. And now I'm reading from Odell. This relationship finds one of its most compelling expressions in William James' 1890, The Principles of Psychology, defining attention as the ability to hold something before the mind. James observes that the inclination of attention is toward its opposite. It is toward fleetingness. He quotes the physicist and physician Hermann von Helmholtz, who had experimented on himself with various, and here's another word for critical media studies that we're using a lot, various distractions. Okay, here's von Helmholtz. The natural tendency of attention, when left to itself, is to wander to ever new things. And so soon as the interest of its object is over, so soon as nothing new is to be noticed there, it passes, in spite of our will, to something else. If we wish to keep it upon one and the same object, we must seek constantly to find out something new about the latter, especially if other powerful impressions are attracting us away. And I guess where James goes from this is that what Helmholtz is doing is giving you this empirical description of attention, a naturalistic interpretation of attention, noting its fleetingness, its tendency to be distracted. And that what James wants to seem to introduce is this idea of the act of will that creates, that turns, um, that turns attention into a voluntary sustained act. So let me read here now, back to Odell. It is also true that this state must resist our tendency to declare our observations finished, to be done with it. For James, as for Helmholtz, this means there is no such thing as voluntary sustained attention. In fact, instead, what passes for sustained attention is actually a series of successive efforts, acts of will, to bring attention back to the same thing. And then James himself, she quotes, though the spontaneous drift of thought is all the other way, the attention must be strained on that one, so it can't happen voluntarily. Everything about attention is prone to distraction. Though the spontaneous drift of thought is all the other way, the attention must be strained on that one object until at last it grows, so as to maintain itself before the kind with ease. This strain of attention is the fundamental act of will. Okay. Have a comment or?
Yeah, I think the thing to note, right, is that to me, and I don't know how well I'm going to be able to articulate this, right, but we've talked about a number of times the significance of daydreaming, right?
Indeed.
As it means like, sort of discovery and inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Attention must be deliberate. And it's almost like the two sort of, in terms of if we're going to do something and take something from these exercises, right? That once we latch onto something that sort of shakes us from our daydream, the idea here is that the inclination is going to be to notice it until it passes, which it is inclined to do. And so to maintain the focus is not something that just happens.
Mm-hmm.
It only happens in so long as it is novel. But as soon as we attend to it, it becomes less novel. And we have to then.
And there we have to reenact the act of will or reperform the act of will.
Correct.
Right. Michael, let me ask you a question before we shift to Alioto. And I'm going to help you with the question.
Oh, I appreciate
insofar as I can. Insofar as I can. So we've read some of. I try to read some of the passages that are where Odell is mobilizing her main terms.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you used the word practice, I think, a minute or two ago. So I thought maybe before we transition out of Odell, maybe we can try and do a recap about and try to describe the kinds of practices that Odell is that Odell thinks constitute true acts of attention. Because at another point, and let me help you with the question. At one point near the end of the chapter, she kind of mentions her goal. And that armed with these concepts about and this understanding of attention from James, she says, I am thinking and I'm urging you, reader, to develop, to work toward a quote, disciplined deepening of attention, as opposed to other ways of paying attention, the ways in which we pay attention, not just on the internet, but not, the internet is not the only place where we have distractions. Of course, it's a major place. But the goal is to move away from distraction toward uh, a disciplined deepening of attention that leads to self-criticism and criticality and critical reflection. So, how would you describe the kind of practices that she's urging us to do in order to achieve this disciplined
Well,
deepening of attention?
this might be a head-on answer. It
Okay,
also might be a dodge, and I don't mean it to be, but I think that what I'm the question I think you're asking, and so maybe that's probably the best place to start, right? Is
okay,
how is it that we can what are the things that are going to prompt us to attend more carefully to things? Because
I
the
think that's it.
problem we have, and I think this is at the core of Odell, and I think it also speaks volumes, or at least it explains the underpinning of, or what underpins Alioto's arguments, is that we are in a very saturated, very automatic um, existence. And
Mhm.
so the thing that struck me about this is I think it starts the chapter when she talks about the John Cage performance.
Indeed, indeed,
And
it does. It actually that passage is close if you want to reference it.
yeah, I don't
It's 111. It's 111. It's
let me see.
where we were before when I mentioned it. And the quote I read about artists interested in using art as an influence is at the end of the page.
Well, I don't think we need to necessarily
Okay.
read it, but the thing that I recall from this is that part of what makes that performance work or do something as opposed to be sort of, performative.
Mhm.
What's the word I'm looking for? Anyways, the thing that makes it work, excuse me, right?
Rather than just a distraction.
Yes,
Right.
is that we come in, you come into that performance with a set of expectations born out of context, right? And that as the audience waits for something to happen, their own, collectively, the experience of waiting highlights all of the things that should not be a part of this moment, right? So the
Right.
coughing or the externalities to what should be a very quiet and focused, piano performance, right? And so to me, it seems like the thing for Odell is that we need something to challenge or to make the routine that we have in a moment clear to us. And that
Right.
in that
That's great.
in that contradiction, if you, that's not the right word. What's the word I'm looking for? Sort of it in the confluence of the expected and the unexpected, we have this sort of almost liminal moment, right? Where we're on the verge of what we expect to happen, but we're still sort of held back from actually experiencing the expected. And then in that
Right.
moment, we can attend to what is. And then this is where will comes in. If you will sort of dwell there, it can expand, but it has to be intentional. And she talks about this here, and we in the rose garden stuff from the last time we spoke about her,
Mhm.
this idea that one observation begets another, and
Mhm.
this chapter sort of, I mean, I'm a huge fan of hers. I love the way she writes. I think that she gets to the end of this chapter and you realize like this has really been kind of her own thinking her way through what is Cupertino. And so to me, to answer the question in a very long-winded way, I think that we need a challenge or something has to confront the expectations that we have
Right.
in a way that prompts us to step back and reconsider. And in reconsidering, we have to see and notice and attend to something new or unexpected. And then in that moment, we can be decisive. We
I
can
love that. I love that. And I don't have anything to add to it except I'll say two things parallel to it that are kind of suggested
right.
that are suggested in your answer. At one point, you talked about context and the importance of looking at the context differently or recontextualizing. And what I think you're saying and what I think she's saying, my take on it would be that she's interested in routines that, to use your word, routines that break up the context and make the context new to you. And then I just add one more thing to it. I think that she is, and now I'm thinking about pivoting to Alioto because this
Before
might
you
be a
pivot,
possible
though,
difference. Okay,
before you
sure.
pivot, I'd like to actually hear your take on
Yeah.
this
Hmm.
wholesale. Before like, what is it other than so my answer to the question is that we need some sort of prompting. That it is very,
Yeah.
very difficult for us to
Yeah.
get out of a routine without something to sort of knock us out or jar us out, even if it's just momentarily.
Yeah.
How do you see this in terms of uh, us being able to be more? Because this is akin to meditation in a weird way.
Uh, I think it is, and I think. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, no, that's all. That's all.
Well, I was. I think I'm doing that.
Okay.
I think there are two things that are going on. I think there is a. Uh, I think she feels there are certain routines and practices that the individual needs to enact, and I just use the kind of key word I think for her, that there's a kind of in the individual wants, who desires, and this would be the other crucial word I think for her, environment, the individual who desires to get a new take, a deeper connection, a more meaningful connection with their environment, has to enact, I think, not just one routine, but a plethora of routines. You have to be searching for routines that will disrupt. And then I want to use all the words you use, right? That will, environment tends to, we tend to develop habits. This is much, we're really in William James category here. Um, the individual gets into a habitual relation to their environment. Uh, it leads to a deadening of experience, a deadening of perception, a deadening of sensibility. And to reawaken, the individual has to practice these defamiliarizing techniques, these defamiliarizing routines. And the payoff is a deeper relationship. I mean, it's a little bit like Heidegger, if I may, don't worry, I'm just going to do Heidegger 101. Heidegger always, the critique of Heidegger's critique of humanism is there is no humanism that's worthy of the name that only exalts the human, right? There is always, in his mind, Dasein. Let's redefine for a moment Dasein as the environment. In that sense, I think Odell is very akin to Heidegger because she's saying there's no way that the individual can find meaning or personal meaning unless they somehow rekindle, reformat, recontextualize the environment in which they're placed, right? So that I think is kind of key to her.
It's fascinating to me, and I think that this works with what you're saying here. The idea here isn't that we break a habit or we disrupt the environment. It's that
Right,
we observe it
right.
and then oddly enough, keep it,
And then
but
rely on it.
observe
Right.
our place in it, and that in achieving that different perspective, the our understanding of the environment changes. This gets us back to the very beginning here, where we understand that there's a whole lot more happening than what
Indeed.
we're aware of. We're not trying to
Right.
find someplace different or something different. We're simply trying to change the lens to
That's so
identify.
important, what you just said. That's so important. It's not about changing the world outside you, it's about perceiving it differently,
Yeah.
right? You're not trying to change it.
No,
Um,
because if you change it, you lose the entire value of doing this in the first
exactly.
place, which is
Exactly.
understand which is perceiving those things that we don't perceive because we are stuck in a singular perspective.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it's, let me just say one more thing. I
Yeah,
don't
please,
I
please.
don't think the argument is that the perspective that we have is wrong or lacking in and of itself, right? The idea is simply that the perspective that we have is just a single perspective and should not be taken as the default perspective.
Absolutely. In fact, the default perspective is, according to Odell, and I rightly so, the problem, right? That's what gets habitual, and that's what starts to feel meaningless. And that's what basically numbs you. And the other thing about, if you're dead to your environment, you're dead inside as well, right? There's a lack of meaning. You experience that as a meaning vacuum.
Right.
So yeah, that's really crucial. Maybe we're ready to. So I think we've identified a couple things that are crucial to Odell. So I think environment, the individual, but not just the individual, right? And she's not, even though all these practices require a willing individual, an individual who wants to break their
And then,
habits,
yeah, yeah.
an
And
intentional.
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. An intentional, even though it requires that, it's all about securing or maintaining or discovering, maybe for the first time, a more meaningful understanding of your environment, a more meaningful relation to the environment. Okay, I think those are her high points. Maybe now we can sort of shift and think about, where does the taste economy fit? Where does Web 3.0? Where's the taste economy? Daisy Alioto, however you want to talk about this. What seems to be different? What seems to be similar?
So I think it's important that we are careful with how we position Alioto here, because she's not, as I understand her, she's not saying that the taste economy is a good thing at all. And she's not saying that Web 3.0 solves all our problems at all, right? I think that Alioto is very critical of the taste economy because as it has existed algorithmically, it puts us in the very same place that Odell is arguing we should get away from, which is a lack of intentionality, um, a lack
And
of.
constant distraction, right?
Well, I was
Or
just gonna say,
rather,
I
we're
was just gonna
constantly fed
say
the same thing.
a lack of slowness, which is a weird phrasing,
And
but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's rapidity is the problem,
right.
and its insistence that this is the way is the problem. And
Mhm.
so, when we spoke about Alioto, I hope we made this clear, right? That her argument was that the shift to Web 3.0 opened up an opportunity with the semantic web where we might possibly, in sidestepping the algorithm, have the opportunity to be more deliberate with our practices online and possibly connect to things that, for better or for worse, are our own choosing as opposed to some algorithmic derivative. And, you know, again, I don't, the assumption it seems with Odell is that when we do slow down and we are intentional and we do pay attention to what we see, there's a big assumption here that one, not only will it be different and more laden with meaning, but somehow that's going to be a good thing, right? That's the optimism in this exercise here, right? Is that when you do pay attention, you're hopefully going to like what you see, because if your new perspective is bad, that's a challenge for you. But I think it's the exact same idea, like that what Alioto is arguing we could potentially be doing with Web3 is making more intentional, more deliberate, and therefore hopefully more meaningful connections
Mhm.
with the content that we find, and that it speaks to us and broadens us or deepens us or satisfies us in some way that is at least of our choosing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't. Uh, I'll mention this, and please please make sure I keep it brief, but kind of laughed when you were mentioning I did laugh when you mentioned about
Liking what we
the
find.
optimism of the optimistic view of phenomenology, that if one takes a phenomenological perspective,
You're gonna like it.
reality, you're going to like what you see. And I laughed because sadly enough, and maybe this is just because maybe this is the male bias, but when you think of a phenomenological a novel, or I guess we'll call it a novel, like Rilke's The Notebooks of Malta Lorid Brigg, or Sartre's Nausea. That the premise of both of these is that if you really pay attention to existence in your environment, you're going to go crazy.
Right.
So,
But at least it's your choosing. At least you haven't been.
well, for Sartre, that's your freedom. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Well, and I guess I was wondering, can we reconcile that with Odell? I think we can say that at this point in the 21st century, that the internet is such a thing that the problem of distraction is maybe the major problem of perception, and not the problem of perceiving existence per se. That's what it was for. Is that's what's changed? I mean, is that what makes Odell tonic? Is that we feel, she feels, she anatomizes herself and sort of suggests, my problem is a failure of attention, a lack of paying attention to the environment. That seems to be my besetting problem. And maybe, insofar as that we're creatures of the internet, maybe that is our problem with perception now. Does that make sense?
It does. I don't know, because I think that, and I mean, this could be, I could be just, picking at nits here, but it's not just that we don't pay attention, because I do think we attend to things,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's that we don't have intentionality. We are
We don't have
just
focused attention.
yeah. So, like, I think about when my kids play some of these video games, and you've got this massive screen that is every color under the rainbow flashing and blinking at the same time. And it's like, good God, how would anybody attend to anything in this? And yet you watch, and the game gets played, and meaning gets derived from some of it, and some of it's just there to distract and do whatever. We attend to things. The problem is that we are, I think, increasingly less critical of what we attend to. And I think that we are, in being less critical, we are simultaneously becoming more accepting of anything.
Right.
And I think that our scope, or our vision, is getting narrow. We're having a harder time. And this, I believe, is very much a function of what you're talking about, is that we're having a harder time conceiving of other possibilities. And
Right.
that's where this gets, I think when we sort of get sucked into the gravity of a default, and we say, well, this is what is, this is the gaze that I'm supposed to have, this is the perspective, we are losing our ability to step outside that, or our desire to. I mean, I used it's such an old reference, but I think it works. I mean, when we were talking about this the other day, I keep coming back to this idea of the matrix. It's like, if you're aware of it, but why would you pay attention to it if it's not as, easy, if it doesn't satisfy with as much ease?
Right. Right.
Because it's work. I mean, that's her point. It is work.
Did you want to add anything more to your observation about Alioto and
I
the
don't
taste
think so.
economy?
Would you? I don't. Do you have I missed something? Would you?
No, I think otherwise. I think we're kind of ready here to sign off.
Well, Barry, I've been paying attention, man, and this was a fun conversation to have.
Thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely, sir. Have a great evening. We'll talk later.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.